Good morning. I think I found an open classroom, so no one is in here. So hopefully, hopefully another class won't show up. But since we only have 3 minutes till 11, I think I'm safe. I think I can be in here. For some reason, the class I've been running to ordinarily over the last couple of weeks when the equipment hasn't been working had a student waiting for a math class in it today. So I had to find someplace else to go. Well, while we wait for 11 o'clock to roll around, we've still got a couple of minutes. Let me just talk about what we'll be doing this week. So we have 3 classes this week and 3 lectures on Judaism. We'll conclude our study of Judaism on Friday by talking about Judaism and modernity. And we're going to have 2 assignments this week. So your first assignment is going to be today. You'll have your online quiz on Judaism that'll go active when I finish the lecture today, and you will have until the start of class on Wednesday. So at 11 a.m. on Wednesday, not p.m., 11 a.m. on Wednesday to complete that 5-question quiz. All 5 multiple choice questions will be based on today's lecture, so feel free to download the lecture slides and review them as you take that quiz. And then on Friday, after we conclude Judaism, I'm going to have another online assignment for you to do. And the reason why we have 2 assignments this time is because next week we're going to begin our 5 lectures on Christianity. And to help reinforce your knowledge of Judaism before we march on into Christianity, I wanted to give you another assignment just to reinforce some of those ideas. And then, of course, we'll eventually get to our 4th exam, which isn't until November 6th. So November 6th will be the exam on Judaism and Christianity. Obviously, there's a lot of content to cover there. There'll be 10 lectures worth of material. I will provide you with a study guide a week ahead of time. But I will say that this is a more difficult exam just by virtue of the fact that there's so much more content to review. Question? That's correct, Alex. So the online quiz on Judaism is just based on today's lecture. So you can download these slides and review them as you do the quiz. Okay, well, it is now officially 11 a.m. and no other class has arrived here, so I think I'm safe in this room as an academic refugee looking for a place where the equipment actually works. So let's go ahead and dive into this 3rd lecture on Judaism, and we left off last time talking about all the various empires that conquered the land of Judea and the city of Jerusalem. And we talked about the impact that those different conquests had. Of course, the most important being the Babylonian exile, where the Babylonians conquered Judea and they destroy the Temple of Solomon and they kill off the monarchy and they take the leaders of the community into exile with them back into Babylon. And then we talked about the Persians who conquered the Babylonians and allowed for the return of the Jewish exiles to Judea and the construction of a 2nd temple. We have the onset of the 2nd temple period. And then we have the Greeks, and the Greeks are followed by the Romans. So it's the Roman period that I want to begin with today. And once we get to the Roman period, we find a Jewish community that is not united at all. We have a variety of forms of Judaism being practiced at the same time. We have one faction, which we know as the Sadducees, who represent the old form of Judaism centered around the animal sacrifices in the temple. This form of Judaism is led by the priests who perform those rituals. This was the type of Judaism that had to stop once the 1st temple was destroyed. But once you have the 2nd temple constructed, then this form of Judaism can resume. However, when the first temple was destroyed, we saw a new type of Judaism develop in the exile, and that was the form that is represented by the Pharisees. And that's the precursor to what we know as Judaism today, or rabbinic Judaism. This was the type of Judaism that focused on the study, well, first the writing, but then the study of sacred texts, the written record of the Torah and subsequent books that make up the Tanakh. We talked all about the Tanakh, or the Hebrew Bible, in class last time. And this faction is led by teachers of the sacred text, scholars of the sacred text, who we know as the rabbis. And the rabbis talk about the existence of not only a written Torah, a written record of the terms of the covenant, the special relationship between Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the Israelites, or Jewish people, but they also talk about the existence of an oral Torah, that Moses received additional revelation that wasn't written down, but which was passed on from generation to generation. And the leaders of this faction purport that they possess that knowledge as well, which guides proper interpretation of the written text. So the Pharisees are far more popular. Right? They are a more accessible form of Judaism, one that focuses on, everyday piety on the part of every member of the community, whereas the Sadducees, they're performing their rites and the rituals in the temple, and what goes on beyond those immediate confines isn't of the utmost significance to them. So the Pharisees are the more popular faction, although the Sadducees are still influential. Then we have a couple of other forms to talk about. We have the Essenes. The Essenes represent a type of Jewish asceticism, a form of Judaism that believed that society had become so corrupt and so immoral that God's final judgment was imminent, was going to happen at any time. So we would characterize the Essenes as being apocalyptic, right? They're getting ready because they think the world as we know it is going to end, and everyone's going to be judged for how they live their lives. And so they're trying to get ready. They've withdrawn from society. They're off in the wilderness. They're celibate. They're engaged in ritual bathing, ritual purifications to try and cleanse themselves of sin, so that they will be on the right side when it comes to that final judgment. Then we have this final group, the Zealots. The Zealots are Jewish militants who want to take up arms against the presence of these foreign powers like the Romans in order to restore the old Jewish kingdom, purify Israel of this foreign pagan religious cultures and ideas, so purge Jewish society of Roman and Greek and Persian influences, and try to restore some sense of Jewish purity, and thus do that by means of a kind of holy war. So we've got these four factions present, and it's this last faction, the Zealots, who are going to spark this big event in the year 66 that will leave us with only one of the four remaining. So in the year 66, the Zealots, who have been agitating for a holy war against the mighty Roman Empire, have their way. A full-scale revolt, a rebellion against the Roman authorities begin. And the Romans, of course, are a superpower in those days for a reason. They're very powerful militarily, and they crush their opponents. And that is ultimately what happens here as well. So the Romans crack down very, very harshly on these Jewish rebels who are rejecting their authority and control of the region. And this ultimately leads to the destruction of the Second Temple. So this was the temple that was constructed once Cyrus the Great, the leader of the Persian Empire, allowed the Jewish exiles to return to Jerusalem. Now that temple is destroyed in the year 70. And that is the end of Temple Judaism. There has been no temple in Jerusalem since. So if you've got no temple again, what does that mean? No Sadducees, right? You can't have the Sadducees and all their sacrificial rites and rituals without the temple. So that eliminates one of the four factions. Sadducees out of the picture. We've got three left. We've got the Pharisees, we've got the Essenes, and we've got the Zealots. Well, the Zealots are the ones who wanted to fight the Romans, and they're fighting the Romans head on, and they eventually lose. The Romans are the superior military power, and they kill off the heart of the Zealot movement, and they are crushed. Meanwhile, the Essenes, who are off in the wilderness, bathing and praying, and getting ready for the end of the world, well, they kind of get stuck in the middle of this conflict. They're off in the wilderness, and the Romans are running around trying to hunt down the Zealots. They come across the Essenes in the wilderness, and they don't treat them any differently. They slaughter the Essenes. So the Essenes are out of the picture as well. Last faction, the Pharisees, and they were already the most popular, and so it's the Pharisees who are the last group standing. So the future of Judaism and its historical development is subsequently dictated by this type of Judaism, Pharisaic Judaism, with its emphasis on sacred writings, on rabbis, on prayer, on personal piety, on adherence to this system of law as articulated by these interpreters of the sacred text. So today we're going to focus on the form of Judaism that comes to us from the Pharisees, and this is the form of Judaism known as rabbinic Judaism. So at the center of the Pharisaic tradition, what would become rabbinic Judaism are the rabbis. Now, the word rabbi in Hebrew means my master or my teacher, my Lord, but not in the divine sense. They are the scholars, those who study and master the sacred texts. First and foremost, the Torah, but the other books of the Tanakh as well. And as I mentioned before, that in the Pharisaic tradition, there was a belief that there was an oral Torah that went along with the written Torah that had been passed along through oral tradition over the centuries, going all the way back to Moses at Mount Sinai. So they claimed that they possessed that unique knowledge as well that guided their interpretation of the written text. So the rabbis would study the Torah, and from the Torah derive a comprehensive code by which Jews were supposed to live. This was called the halakha, or what we could translate as Jewish law. The word literally means a path by which you live by. And so it covers all areas of life. Now, not all of it is readily apparent from the written text, so there's a good deal of interpretation that goes on, and there may be disagreement among these different human scholars who are interpreting the text. So it's quite an elaborate and diverse body of legal knowledge that Jews engage in debates about, and you may have different interpretations. At the heart of this legal tradition centered around halakha, you have what the rabbis identify as 613 mitzvot, or commandments, rooted in the Torah. Now, we talked about the 10 commandments on the stone tablets given to Moses, but in the rabbinic tradition, there's another 603 that's also present within the Torah itself. So it's quite a comprehensive legal code by which to live by. And it's not just law as such, but also includes ethical and moral precepts that would all be categorized as mitzvot as well. Unlike the tradition of the priesthood at the temple, where only members of a particular Israelite branch, those coming from the line of Aaron, the brother of Moses, could actually be a priest. In Pharisaic tradition, anyone with the proper knowledge, the proper education, proper training could be a rabbi, at least any man. When you get to the post-Enlightenment period in modern times, then we'll begin to see some branches of Judaism ordain women as rabbis, but we'll talk about that in my 5th lecture, the lecture on Judaism and modernity. But the tradition was always that only men could be rabbis. Rabbis they're not like the Essenes, they're not celibate off living in the wilderness. Instead, they're just like everyone else. They get married, they have a family. In fact, that's strongly encouraged. That's an important part of the Jewish tradition, to marry and have kids. And so they're not a people who are apart from other aspects of society in the way we might think of a Roman Catholic priest, for example. The center of the rabbis' influence were these institutions, these assembly houses, where people would gather to study and debate and discuss the sacred text. And in time, these structures also became places for ritual worship, houses of prayer. And we most commonly know these facilities as synagogues. Now, the word synagogue is Greek, and it means assembly hall or assembly house. Other terms that are used are the Yiddish term shul, or the Hebrew term Beit Knesset, which also means house of assembly. So the synagogue is something which has its roots in the diaspora community during the Babylonian exile, and it begins to develop subsequently in the post-exile period, the Second Temple period, and then, of course, with the destruction of the Second Temple, it becomes the center of Jewish practice, places for the community to gather, to study and learn the writings of the Torah and the Tanakh, to engage in daily prayers, and it's always preferable to perform your prayers in congregation. The minimum for a congregation is 10 adult males, called a minyan, and so that's always preferable to individual prayer, even if individual prayer is permissible. By the time we're advancing into the Common Era, you reach the 3rd century, we're beginning to see some reoccurring architectural features in these unique structures. One of them is that the buildings are constructed to face the site where the temple once stood in Jerusalem. So depending on what part of the world that synagogue is constructed, it would be a different direction. So for example, if the synagogue were constructed in Persia, it would face west, right? To face Jerusalem and the site of the temple. If it's in Egypt, it's going to face northeast to face the site of the temple in Jerusalem. On the wall that actually faces the direction of Jerusalem, you have a special niche, which is eventually replaced by a kind of cabinet that then also has curtains over it, where scrolls of the Torah are kept. So imagine, of course, that this is the time before the printing press exists, and you don't have traditional bound copies of books early on. Instead, you have them written on these scrolls, and the scrolls are kept in the most sacred space in the synagogue, and that is this area called the Ark, right? And we've talked about the idea of the Ark of the Covenant before, that once held the tablets of the law. Then you also have a special podium, a lectern called a bima, that when you remove the scrolls from the Ark and you unravel them on the podium, when someone reads for them, you place it on this appropriate elevated platform. It's also common to find, and you can see it in this image here, a menorah. Now, this is a traditional synagogue menorah. It is based off of a description of this large menorah, this large lamp that once existed in the temple in Jerusalem. You can find that described in the pages of the Torah itself. And it has 3 arms on each side. Now, if you've seen a menorah before, you've probably seen a Hanukkah menorah. And a Hanukkah menorah is different. It has 4 arms on each side because it's about the 8 nights of Hanukkah. So this one is a little bit different than that, but it is a menorah in both instances. When synagogues first began to be used, they didn't have chairs or benches. Instead, people would come and they would sit on mats on the floor or cushions on the floor. And then over the centuries, particularly in synagogues in Europe, we begin to see the adoption of chairs, benches, pews, and that's become the prevailing norm in synagogues around the world today. Although if you go to a Muslim mosque, you can get a sense of what early synagogues were like, because in mosques, you still sit on the ground in those houses of worship. Men and women are also separated, so you have gender segregation in this holy place of prayer and study. The men would be in the section around the bima and the ark, the central area, and then there would be a separate section behind a mechitza, some kind of barrier or curtain where the women would be, or in some cases, you might have a balcony, a second level, and that's where the women would be. But even husbands and wives would be separate within the synagogue. When you get to modern post-Enlightenment Judaism, we begin to see some forms of Judaism, the same ones that begin to ordain women as rabbis, allowing for men and women to sit together in the synagogue. But the traditional synagogue layouts, and this still exists in Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Judaism, separates the genders. Men and women do not sit together in synagogues, and you can see that same influence on subsequent Muslim practice. You go to a mosque, you'll see the same thing, a separation of the genders. Here you see some images of the sacred Torah scrolls, the Sefer Torah. This is what is kept in the ark and the front wall, the Jerusalem-facing wall of the synagogue. So these are handwritten, and these are treasured by their communities. Obviously, you know, the Torah is a lengthy work, and so to write it out all by hand, to do so correctly, right, without the typos and other problems that can occur during handwriting, makes these very valuable indeed. And The existence of these scrolls continues to exist in modern times, even with printing presses and mass production of text. Communities will still have these sacred handwritten Torah scrolls that are kept there, even if for individual congregants, they may have mass-produced, printed copies, a chumash, for themselves as well. But within the ark, you would still have these sacred scrolls, or multiple scrolls, in fact. During worship services in a synagogue, someone who possesses the knowledge of the text, and in pre-modern times, that would entail memorization when you didn't have text as readily available in, physical form, and one who also has the ability to properly lead the prayers, and so can not only know the text and know what should be recited during worship services, but also do so well, do so properly. And over the centuries, this also placed an emphasis on musical knowledge as well, that prayers, that liturgical services should be musical in nature. And so we see the development of this special role, the role of a hazan, or a cantor, as they're commonly referred to in English. This is the person responsible for leading worship services. So this is actually a separate position from the rabbi. The rabbi's significance and authority is based on his mastery of the text, and thus can teach and guide people in how to live according to the text. The actual leading of the worship service is led up to the cantor. Now, someone could be trained in both and do both jobs, but they are separate positions. Here we can see an image of a contemporary synagogue, and you can tell that this is an Orthodox synagogue because you'll notice that there's no women in the picture. So here we see gender segregation being practiced. It's all men, and the women would be in a separate section. And you can see also we have the addition of a choir, so we'll see the use of a choir adopted in synagogue services as well. So let's talk more about the details of Jewish prayer. If prayer acted as the substitute for the temple sacrifices that once occurred in Jerusalem, prayer, it becomes the central ritual, the central act of Jewish worship. And so it becomes very important, and it's not a spontaneous thing. It's not a thing where you feel moved to say, dear God, so-and-so, so-and-so, amen, right? It's not a kind of spur of the moment sort of thing. It is a formal ritualized practice that the rabbis lay out all the steps and the rules and the procedures involving. So Jewish prayer is traditionally supposed to be done 3 times every day at specific times. The first at dawn, the second at midday, and the third at dusk. And in rabbinic literature that we'll learn about later on in the lecture today, known as the Talmud, the rabbis explain that the 3 patriarchs who we already learned about in my first lecture on Judaism, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, are the sources for these 3 prayers. That Abraham is credited with the first prayer at dawn, Isaac with the second at midday, and Jacob, aka Israel, for the third of the 3 daily prayers at dusk. There can be additional prayers, especially when we're talking about a holy day like Yom Kippur, but for an ordinary day, devout Jews are expected to perform these 3 daily prayers. And I could note too that when Islam begins in the 7th century, Muslims too pray 3 times a day, and this becomes 5. And so you have in Islam 5 daily prayers at specific times. But in the Jewish tradition, it was 3, and it remains at 3. Prayers can be done anywhere in the world so long as it is ritually clean. So you wouldn't do it, for example, in a butcher shop where there's blood and places like that, or a bathroom, but everywhere else is acceptable. You can do the prayers outside. But of course, once you have synagogues, then a synagogue becomes an ideal place to do so. As I mentioned before, a communal prayer is always preferable to an individual prayer, even if individual prayer is permissible as well. And in order to meet the minimum for a congregational prayer, according to the rabbis, you have to have 10 adult men. And what makes someone an adult? It's not 18, it's the age of 13. So a Jewish boy, once he reaches the age of 13, he's a man. It becomes a bar mitzvah, a son of the commandments. And so then he's recognized as an adult. So you need 10 Jewish males who have been bar mitzvah, are 13 or older, in order to have a minyan, to have a congregational service. If you have less than that, then let's say you have 9, well, then you're going to have 9 individual prayers performed. You have to have 10 according to the rabbis. In order to know which passages are to be read during the prayer, it's common for people to use a prayer book, a siddur, and that's what you can see here and in the hands of this young man here. And then we have additional ritual objects that are traditionally used during the daily prayers. And the young man in the lower right-hand corner is using all three, and we'll look at them in closer detail, but let's just run through them quickly at the start. First, we have the wearing of tefillin. Tefillin are these leather straps that are wrapped around the arm and then go up over the head. Then you also have the wearing of the talit. This is especially for the dawn prayer, the first of the 3 daily prayers. This is the talit. In Yiddish, it's called a talis. And then we have the wearing of the yarmulke or kippah, which is the skull cap worn on the head to show reverence and fear of God. Especially important during prayer, but for traditional devout Jews, this would be worn all the time as well, with the exception of sleeping and bathing. Let's look at those objects in closer detail now. First, we have the prayer shawl. This is the talit, the talis, or the talis in Yiddish. And this is worn by Jewish men during the dawn prayer. And you can see that there are some different ways in which it is worn. And here too, we have some disagreement among the rabbis as to which way is correct or what ways are permissible. So you can see that this man simply has it wrapped around his neck. This man and this man have it up over their heads. So there are some different ways in which the talit is used. And on the holiest day of the year, which is Yom Kippur, the word Yom in Hebrew means day, and Kippur means atonement. That's the day of repentance, and it involves 25 hours of fasting. And for that holiest day of the year, Jewish men will wear the talit for all the prayers, but otherwise they would only wear it for the first of the 3 daily prayers. Now, in this image in particular, you can see it here too, but in this image in particular, you can see that there are these strings with these knots hanging from the talit. And that tells us why this shawl is worn. It's worn to observe this specific commandment. Remember, there's 613 commandments in the Torah, according to the rabbis. And so one of those commandments is derived from this passage in Deuteronomy, one of the 5 books of the Torah, chapter 22, verse 12. Yahweh commands, you shall make yourself twisted threads on the 4 corners of your garment with which you cover yourself. So based on this mitzvah, this commandment, the shawl is worn and it has these twisted threads with these knots on them hanging from the 4 garments. And the knots in those, what are called tzitzits, those tassels, are considered to be representations of the binding nature of the covenant between the Jewish people and Yahweh. So to remind you of your obligations, that's what these knots signify, right? That you're supposed to follow these. Now, the talit, of course, is worn for the daily prayers, but some, especially in the far more conservative branches of Judaism today, will also wear another type of garment called a talit katan, which is an undershirt underneath their day-to-day clothing. And you'll see the tassels observed here. So we can see a man who's walking along the street. He's wearing his ordinary shirt, and underneath we can see the tzitzits, the tassels hanging out from his talit katan, which he's wearing underneath his shirt. Now we have the tefillin. So the tefillin are the leather straps I mentioned. This is a particularly interesting rabbinic interpretation. So this is based off of this mitzvah, this commandments in the Torah, also from the book of Deuteronomy, where Yahweh says, you shall put these words of mine on your heart and on your soul, and you shall tie them for a sign upon your arm, and they shall be as totafot between your eyes. So based on this commandment, the rabbis say, you're supposed to do this. So this is a leather strap, and the leather strap is attached to 2 small leather boxes. And contained within these leather boxes, there is a small scroll with a passage from the Torah written on it. So it says in the Torah, you shall put these words of mine on your heart and on your soul. You shall tie them for a sign upon your arm, right? So here it is, the leather strap is wrapped around his arm. And here's the words of mine in this box. And then another box is worn on the forehead. And they shall be as totafot between your eyes. So the Hebrew word here, totafot, which I left in the Hebrew, is ambiguous. And so if you're just reading it, the original meaning, the exact meaning is lost in the classical Hebrew, but according to the rabbinic tradition of interpretation, it refers to these boxes here. So that's where the practice of wearing the tefillin comes from. Then we have the yarmulke, or the kippah, the skull cap. So the rabbinic scholars say that Jewish men should at all times cover their heads. This is definitely part of prayer, but according to conservative traditional branches of Judaism, it should be worn at all times. And this is a symbol of reverence, of fear of God, this sense that God is so powerful, is so mighty that you would almost shield your head in the presence of his might and his glory. And certainly if you go into a synagogue, you should wear this. If you visit a synagogue and you're not Jewish, you may be asked to wear a yarmulke as well to cover your head while within the synagogue itself. The only time in which you wouldn't wear this, if you're part of a branch of Judaism that dictates that men should wear this at all times, would be if you're bathing, you're taking a shower, or when you're sleeping at night. Otherwise, you should wear it at all times. And I've read cases of, for example, Orthodox Jewish kids who play basketball in like high school wearing the kippah, with the pin to keep it on their heads, even while playing a sport, where it may fall off. That's how serious the mitzvah, the commandment, is taken. In Judaism today, there are these very conservative forms of Judaism, the Hasidim or Haredim, and the men from these branches of Judaism often wear these black brimmed hats. So if you've seen images of these men before, or maybe you visited a place like Williamsburg in Brooklyn, in New York City, where there's a large Hasidic community, you might think that these are being worn as a substitute for the kippah or the yarmulke. That's actually not the case. And I realize the image is sort of hard to see, but these men are actually wearing a kippah underneath the brimmed hat. So even here, where men are wearing another hat, they're wearing the yarmulke or the kippah underneath the hat. So they're still following this practice. There's another unique feature that we can see in this image of these young, ultra-conservative, ultra-Orthodox men, is these men have let the hair over their ears grow out long and form these sort of side curls. These are called payas. And according to their rabbis, their interpreters of the Torah, they look to this particular mitzvah, this commandment recorded in the book of Leviticus, chapter 19, verse 27, where Yahweh commands, you shall not round off the payot of your head. So the payot here generally means corners of your head. And according to the rabbis, there are 5 corners to the head. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So in those 5 points, you're not supposed to cut the hair or shave. So you can have short hair everywhere on your head except here and here. So that's why these young men have let the hair grow out on these corners. Likewise, they're a bit too young, but likewise, they would grow their beards as well. So you have the 2 long curls here, and then you not shaving your beard, you allow the beard to grow. And the rabbinic preference for growing out the beard is something that would also continue on into the Islamic tradition. Now, the Quran, the founding text of Islam, doesn't actually say anything about beards, but according to another set of texts called the Hadith, men are supposed to grow their beards as well. So I've talked about the yarmulke with regard to men covering their head. Well, there's also rules about women. According to the rabbis, and this is something that changes in some branches of modern Judaism, women are expected to cover their hair at all times as well. That the only people who are permitted to see a woman's hair when she's married is her husband, or her children could see it as well. And so we see the practice of Jewish women wearing headscarves. So we can see some women here wearing a variety of headscarves down here as well, covering their hair that only the husband would see the hair. But another practice developed among Jewish women in Europe, and that is the practice of wearing a wig. So only their husband would see their actual hair, and they might even cut their actual hair very short, and then they would wear a wig over it. So they're technically covering their hair, but they also are kind of blending into the rest of society by wearing a wig that roughly resembles, an ordinary head of hair instead of wearing a headscarf. For women who lived in Muslim majority countries, obviously Jewish women and Muslim women traditionally both wear headscarves. So it doesn't stand out as much, but the practice of wearing headscarves, while it does exist in Christianity, particularly in Eastern Orthodoxy, in Western Europe, that practice would largely die out, especially outside of a church. So women would traditionally wear a headscarf while going inside of a church, in Catholicism, for example, but outside they would not. And so Jewish women may choose to wear a wig in those cultural contexts. So we have the rabbis explaining all of this, right? And this stuff gets written down so that that knowledge is preserved. That knowledge continues on. People can study those interpretations and even add to them. So let's talk a little bit about the production of these rabbinic commentaries and this additional information that goes alongside the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. Once we get to the 1st century, the century in which the Second Temple is destroyed, we have the failed revolt against the Romans begin in the year 66 and conclude in the year 70. We have rabbis writing down various stories, anecdotes, information that explains different verses of the Torah. But once you get to the 3rd century, a particular rabbi, Judah Hanasi, or Judah the Prince, who according to tradition is actually from the line of King David, collects all that knowledge and writes it down into a single text called the Mishnah. And the Mishnah takes on the status of revelation by virtue of the fact that in the rabbinic tradition, with its roots in the Pharisaic tradition, they believed that there was an oral Torah that went along with the written Torah revealed to Moses at Sinai. So the written Mishnah was understood to be a written record of the previously oral Torah, to be understood alongside the written Torah, the 5 first books of the Tanakh, or what Christians call the Old Testament. So the Mishnah is a written record of that knowledge, and it gets arranged according to subject. And so we can see the 6 core subjects here: seeds, festivals, women, damages, holy things, and purifications. So we now, to go along with the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, we have this work called the Mishnah, which adds new details, new explanations, new knowledge about how to apply the 613 mitzvot of the Torah to Jewish life. Well, once you have this, rabbis start writing commentaries on the Mishnah, and we get even more literature. So the rabbis are now writing commentaries on the Mishnah of Rabbi Judah, and those commentaries then come to form a new text, and this is the birth of the Talmud. So you've heard me refer to the Talmud a few times already. The Talmud consists of the Mishnah, and then the commentaries written about the Mishnah. And those commentaries are called the Gemara. And if you look at this image on the right-hand side, I have a page from the Talmud here, and you can see that the text is arranged in unusual blocks. It's uniquely arranged. So we have a central row here. This is the Mishnah of Rabbi Judah from the 3rd century. And then the row surrounding it, this is the Gemara. This is the commentary by subsequent generations of rabbis explaining the Mishnah. And then we have yet this other section, which is various footnotes and additional explanations about the Gemara. Now, this literature actually developed into 2 separate texts, depending on the region where the Jewish community was situated. So by this time, we know that we have 2 principal regions where the Jewish community is concentrated. One in Judea, where Jerusalem is. But remember, we talked about the Babylonian exile last time, which took members of the Jewish community and brought them to what we now call Iraq. And that was then conquered by the Persians. And so you have this roughly, Iraqi-Persian, Iraqi-Iranian region of the Jewish community as well. And it's in these 2 regions where 2 different sets of the Talmud would be created, right? Because you have different rabbis producing explanations of the Mishnah there. You have one collection from Judea called the Palestinian Talmud, or also it's called the Jerusalem Talmud. And then you have the Babylonian Talmud, which is the text produced over in Persia. Of these 2, they're both significant, but the Babylonian Talmud would actually have greater influence. In fact, the foremost rabbis of this period going forward in the subsequent centuries would be situated in basically Iraq and what would become from the 7th century onward a part of a Muslim empire. And so for hundreds of years, you had the chief rabbinic authorities existing within the Muslim caliphate in the region. And within the pages of the Talmud, you don't have just one single answer or one single interpretation. You have the interpretations of dozens, if not hundreds, of different rabbis giving different opinions on things. So Jewish thought is quite complex in the fact that there's just not one answer or one interpretation. You get to sort of review and analyze the conclusions of different rabbis and may even follow a minority opinion, while others may follow a majority opinion. And that's part of Jewish thought, that there's sort of this openness towards debate and discourse about interpretation and legal argumentation by which how one should properly follow halakha or Jewish law. So it's quite a rich and complex body of knowledge. So let me give you an example of one of the topics that would be addressed in the Talmud, dietary law. So dietary law in halakha is called kashrut. This deals with what you can and cannot eat as someone who is a party in this covenant between Yahweh and the Jewish people. There are some passages in the Torah that are explicit in what you can and cannot eat, but others require rabbinic interpretation, rabbinic extrapolation, and additional detail. The food that is permissible for an observant Jew to eat is referred to as kosher. You've probably all heard the word kosher before. In fact, it's entered into American colloquial English where we say whether something is right or not. They say, something doesn't seem right. Someone might say, oh, that's not kosher, right? Meaning it's not acceptable. So this is the prevailing interpretation of kashrut, of Jewish dietary law, according to the rabbis. No pork, no pig products, right? No ham, no bacon, none of that, right? And also no product from that. So the grease, none of that that's all not kosher. Shellfish, lobster, shrimp, none of that stuff. That's all forbidden as well. No mixing of meat and dairy. So you can't have a dish that includes a meat product and a dairy product together. You can eat them separately, you can prepare them separately, but you can't mix them together. So for example, Americans like cheeseburgers. A cheeseburger is not kosher. Why? Because it's meat with cheese. Cheese is dairy. What's that based off of? Well, here's an example of the rabbis really doing the work of explaining a passage from the Torah. There's a passage in the Torah that says, "Thou shalt not boil a kid in its mother's milk." So on the surface, you go, well, what does that mean? I don't really understand that. Does that mean that you don't prepare a food by putting meat in the milk and boiling it? You could take it really literally, but according to the rabbis, that means you don't mix meat and dairy. Okay, so kosher food would not include mixing those things, and the food that would include dairy and meat products would also be prepared in separate dishes. If a family is particularly wealthy and they have the means to do so, they may even have separate kitchens, separate sinks, separate refrigerators to keep the dairy and the meat as separated as possible. No predatory mammals or birds. You want to remove as much blood from the animal as possible, so you want to try and drain out all the blood. The animals that are permissible have to have a cloven hoof and chew their cud. So that means that, for example, rabbit meat or camel meat are not permissible either because they don't meet that criteria. And even among animals like a cow, whose meat is acceptable to eat, only certain parts of the animal are kosher. So if you look at this diagram on the right-hand side, here we have a cow. The meat from the upper portion of the body is kosher. This is permissible. So Jews could have, I don't know my cuts of meat very well, but short ribs, okay? That's a kosher part of the cow, whereas the rump roast is not kosher. So the meat from the lower half of the animal is not permissible. It's not kosher. So if you go to a kosher deli, you're not going to find ham. And if you're getting roast beef, it's going to come from this upper part of the cow. The rabbis also explain all the rules and regulations for Jews to observe the Sabbath. So when I talked about the 10 Commandments, the tablets on the stone, tablets that Moses brought from Mount Sinai, I mentioned that one of them was to keep the Sabbath holy. And I talked about how in Judaism, the Sabbath is Saturday, although the day starts the night before. So the Sabbath begins when the sun sets on Friday, and the night precedes the day, and so then the Sabbath will continue through Saturday until the sun sets on Saturday. So that is the Sabbath. So if we're thinking in terms of daylight hours, when people are out and about, the Sabbath is Saturday, but it technically begins when the sun sets the previous evening on Friday. So how do you observe the Sabbath? Well, one way, of course, would be go to services at synagogue on Saturday morning, but in terms of the rabbis explaining special rules you're supposed to live by, you have to abstain from work. And the rabbis explain what constitutes work. It's not just whether you go to your day-to-day job. It also includes something like shopping. Right? Obviously, people aren't supposed to be open selling stuff. That's work. But going and buying and engaging in trade would be a part of work. No cooking either. So for the Sabbath meal on Friday evening, the cooking, the preparation of the meal has to be concluded by the time the sun sets. Once the sun sets, the Sabbath has begun, and you can't engage in cooking anymore. Even something like building a fire. And some contemporary rabbis, now we live in an age where you don't have to light candles to be in a room and to be able to see. We have electric lights and light switches. Some contemporary rabbis even say that you're not supposed to operate a light switch because sending those circuits is analogous to building a fire. And so if you want an electronic device on during the Sabbath, you need to go and turn it on before the sun sets on Friday, and then just leave it on for the duration of the Sabbath. That would include like watching television as well. So if you say, well, we want to watch the news on Saturday, you leave the TV on and you don't operate it during the Sabbath, and you turn it on before the sun sets on Friday. Okay, so it's not a vacation, right? It's a day that includes some pretty considerable restrictions, and the strictness of those restrictions varies among modern denominations of Judaism. And here we can see a passage from the Torah talking about observing the Sabbath, and it reminds us of the creation story from the opening section of Genesis, the first book of the Torah. It says there are 6 days when you may work, but the seventh day is a day of Sabbath, a day of Sabbath rest, a day of sacred assembly. You are not to do any work. Wherever you live, it is a Sabbath to the Lord. So anything that constitutes work, the rabbis forbid from people doing. The rabbis also explain what constitutes purity and impurity. Now, we've talked about purity and impurity a bit in the context of some other religions. I know I talked about it when we discussed Shinto, that in Shinto there was a real emphasis on purification. We can find a similar emphasis on purification in Judaism, and this will carry over particularly into the Islamic tradition, and we can see some Jewish purity rituals in Islamic forms continue on. So the rabbis encourage observant Jews to avoid contact with certain substances that defile you, that make you impure. And if you're in a state of impurity, you can't perform your prayers, you can't touch the Torah, you can't have relations with your spouse, so you need to then purify yourself ritually, a kind of ritual washing that occurs. One of the most important facilities that developed in order for Jews to observe purification rites, and this is especially true of women, is the mikvah. So these are images of a mikvah. This is an ancient mikvah, and this is a modern one, as you can see by the nice tile work and the electric light and so forth. A mikvah is a ritual purification pool, and it requires a minimum amount of water. I think it's 200 gallons according to the rabbis, and it has to be connected to a natural source of water. So it can't just come from a tap, from like city water. It has to be connected to like a basin of rainwater or to a river. Rivers are all naturally kosher mikvahs. So like the River Jordan, where John the Baptist used to purify people in the water, that was a kosher mikvah. So this mikvah, although it's in a building, this is probably the connection to a basin of rainwater or some other natural source of water. And one goes to immerse oneself saying some prayers to purify the whole of your body when you're in a state of greater impurity. This is especially important for women because of a woman's menstrual cycle. That a menstrual cycle causes great impurity on a woman's body, and so before she can engage in prayer or relations with her husband again, she needs to go to a mikvah and immerse herself, so every month, right, in order to purify herself. Lastly, in my remaining couple of minutes, I just want to talk about some Jewish festivals. There are lots of holy days or festivals in the Jewish tradition, but here are 4 of them. The first I've listed here is Pesach, or what we call Passover. The Passover is the annual ritual commemoration of the Exodus story. The Exodus story is the centerpiece of the Torah, where Moses is called by Yahweh out of the burning bush to go to Egypt and liberate the Israelites from bondage and lead them out to travel to the promised land. And so this ritual commemorates the Exodus story. And for the Passover Seder, the ritual meal that takes place, there are various foods that commemorate elements of that story. So in this image, we can see the Passover matzah bread. And matzah bread is unleavened bread. It almost looks like a large cracker. And it's said that the Israelites had to up and leave Egypt so quickly that there was no time to let the dough rise. You know, if you're baking bread, you put the yeast in the bread so that it then rises and you get the nice fluffy bread when you bake it. Well, there was no time to do that. And so this represents the unleavened bread because they had to rush, right, as they were escaping out. Another food that would be consumed is bitter herbs, that the bitter herbs commemorate the bitterness of bondage in Egypt. Next, we've got the festival of Hanukkah. Now, Hanukkah traditionally is not a hugely important Jewish festival. Other days like Passover and Yom Kippur are way, way more important. But here in the United States, Hanukkah is a winter festival. And so it's roughly viewed as sort of like the Jewish equivalent of Christmas. And since Christmas is so popular because of the gift giving and so forth, Hanukkah becomes a gift-giving holiday in modern times, and so it's probably the best known of all Jewish holidays, even though it's not the most important. It is known as the Festival of Lights, and it commemorates this miracle that the Talmud describes as taking place during the revolt against the Greeks by the Maccabees. The Maccabees had taken control of the temple, and there was only enough oil to keep the menorah, the candelabrum in the temple, lit for so many days, and it miraculously burned for 8 nights, despite only having enough oil for 1 night. And so you have the 8 nights of Hanukkah, the festival of lights, and you have the unique Hanukkah menorah as well. Then we have the Jewish New Year, which is Rosh Hashanah. That begins the first of the 10 days of awe. The 10th day, the last day of this special period of the year, is the most sacred day of the year, and that is Yom Kippur, the day I mentioned before, where people would wear the talit for all the prayers throughout the day. This is a day of fasting, the most important day of the year in Judaism, a day when God takes account of everyone's life and whether they're going to live to see another year, evaluates their deeds. And so you would observe fasting for not just 24 hours, but 25 hours, in fact. So no food or drink for the duration of this sacred day. And instead, you engage in prayer and contemplation and repentance to God to purify your soul. All right. I am out of time. Thank you very much. I will see you on Wednesday. Don't forget to do the online quiz, 5 multiple choice questions based on today's lecture. It's due by the start of class on Wednesday, 11 a.m., not 11 p.m. or midnight. See you then.